It was an old wooden board, dusty and forgotten, tucked away in the attic of the house my friends and I had rented for the weekend. The place had a reputation in town. The previous owner, a woman named Eliza, had been obsessed with the supernatural, convinced she could communicate with the dead. She'd passed away mysteriously decades ago, leaving the house abandoned until her distant family inherited it and put it up for rent. My friends thought it would be fun to spend Halloween there. It was supposed to be a joke, a thrill, nothing more. But that old Ouija board changed everything. We found it on the first night. I'd gone up to explore, a flashlight in hand, and there it was, hidden under a pile of decaying boxes. There were symbols carved around the edges, intricate and unfamiliar. I called out to the others, and soon they crowded around, each of them eager to give it a try. Our friend Danny was especially keen. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits and figured it was all just a product of overactive imaginations. He convinced us to play, saying it would be the ultimate Halloween experience. So we sat in a circle, fingers lightly touching the planchette, and asked the first question. "Is anyone here?" Danny's voice echoed through the darkened room. The air felt thick, and the house creaked around us as though it was breathing, settling into some ancient rhythm. For a long moment, nothing happened. The planchette was still, and we exchanged nervous glances, smirking at the absurdity of it all. But just as we were about to give up, the planchette jerked under our fingers, sliding slowly toward yes. None of us dared speak. The movement had been deliberate, nothing like the silly nudges we had felt in past Ouija games. We were all pale, but Danny's bravado returned. "Who are you?" he asked. The planchette moved again, spelling out one letter at a time. Eliza, the name of the house's former owner. Danny chuckled, but his laughter sounded forced. "All right, Eliza," he said, still trying to sound brave. "What do you want?" The planchette shot toward the letters quickly, faster than we'd seen it move before. L-E-A-V-E. "Leave," I whispered, my voice shaky. A heavy silence fell over the room, like a warning. We should have stopped. But Danny, still bent on proving something, smirked. "Oh, come on, Eliza," he mocked. "Why should we leave?" The board responded with speed and precision. D-E-A-T-H. A chill ran through me. The hairs on my arms prickled, and I suddenly felt watched like invisible eyes were studying us. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. My friend Sarah pulled her hands away, visibly shaken, and whispered that we should stop. But Danny refused to listen. He was angry now, irritated that his joke wasn't going the way he'd planned. "You're not real," he spat. "You're just a story." He moved the planchette himself, forcing it toward goodbye with a sneer. But as he lifted his hands, the board began to move on its own. It spelled out something in a rapid blur. I-A-M-R-E-A-L. Everyone jumped back, even Danny. There was a loud crack, like wood splintering, and the room grew icy cold. The lights flickered, and for a moment the shadows seemed to lengthen, closing in around us. I swear I saw something. A figure, faint, like a distorted face, hovering just outside the circle. My throat went dry, and I couldn't look away. It was as if something inhuman was staring straight at me, hollow eyes reflecting a lifetime of anger and anguish. The board continued to move, no one touching it, spelling out a final warning. L-E-A-V-E-N now. We scrambled to our feet, stumbling over each other as we rushed down the stairs, down to the old house, groaning with each hurried step. We reached the front door, breathless, but it wouldn't budge. Danny pulled with all his strength, cursing under his breath, but the door was sealed shut. Behind us, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking down the staircase. One by one, we turned to look, and there, standing on the landing, was a shadow darker than the rest of the room. It seemed to pulse, shifting in shape, and then it stretched, long, bony fingers reaching toward us. Sarah screamed, and suddenly the lights went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, our breaths the only sound. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use its light, but when I clicked it on, the screen was frozen. Every one of our devices was dead. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like the shadow was breathing down our necks. And then, without warning, the front door flew open. We didn't look back. We didn't dare. We ran into the night, the cold air stinging our lungs as we sprinted down the driveway. None of us spoke until we were back at the nearest gas station, trembling and pale, trying to process what had just happened. Later, I found out that Eliza had been found dead, alone in that very house. her face twisted in terror, her hands clutching that same Ouija board we'd used. The coroner had ruled it a natural death, but locals whispered about her obsession with the board and how she'd claimed it was cursed. A friend of mine, a paranormal investigator, said that sometimes spirits cling to the last object they were in contact with, desperately reaching out for anyone who might listen. None of us ever went back to that house, and I haven't touched a Ouija board since. Danny, though, wasn't so lucky. Not long after that night, he began having nightmares. He'd see Eliza's face, hear her voice whispering to him, warning him to leave before it was too late. He brushed it off, calling it nothing but a trick of his mind. But a month later, he stopped coming to class. He wouldn't answer our calls or messages. I finally went to check on him, and when I arrived, his room was cold and empty, with only one thing left behind on the floor, an old wooden Ouija board. It was late, and the rain hammered against the windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. I was alone at my cousin's house, where I was house-sitting for the weekend. The place was an old farmhouse, far out in the country, and my cousin had warned me that strange things happen there sometimes. She laughed it off, calling it an old family curse, but her eyes didn't. They looked haunted. She had insisted I stay in the guest room, and if anything strange happened, never to go into the basement. I'd heard old family ghost stories, so I brushed it off. I didn't believe in that stuff, at least I didn't until that night. I was getting ready for bed when I noticed an antique Ouija board propped up in the corner of the room. It was carved with intricate designs, its letters worn and faded. Curious, I went over to take a closer look. The board looked ancient, and unlike the ones I'd seen at Halloween parties, this one had an odd, unsettling aura. The air around it felt cold, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. Something about it made me hesitate, a whisper at the back of my mind urging me to leave it alone. But curiosity got the best of me. I'd always laughed at horror movies where people messed with Ouija boards, figuring the fear was all in their heads. But the pull was real, almost hypnotic. I took the board to the small table by the window, lit a candle, and placed my fingers on the planchette. "Is anyone here?" I whispered, feeling foolish. For a moment, nothing happened, and I started to relax, chuckling at myself. But just as I was about to move my hand, the planchette slid slowly to "yes." A chill shot down my spine, but I told myself it was just a game. It had to be. "What's your name?" I asked, my voice barely more than a breath. The planchette moved again, one letter at a time. "ELLA." "Ella," I murmured, trying to calm my racing heart. "What do you want?" The candle flickered, and the room seemed to grow colder. I could feel my breath as I waited for a response. The planchette began to move again, faster this time, sliding back and forth as if it was being pushed by some unseen force. "LOOKBHINDYU." My stomach dropped, and the hair on my neck prickled. I wanted to stop, to laugh it off and put the board away, but something held me in place. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to see nothing but the empty room. Instead, I froze. There, in the shadows by the doorway, was a figure, a young woman, pale as the moon, her dark eyes locked onto mine. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a long, lacy dress with a high collar that looked like it was from another century. Her face was gaunt, hollow, and her hands clutched at her throat as if she were choking. Her lips moved silently, mouthing words I couldn't understand. My heart thundered in my chest, and I couldn't look away. The room seemed to darken, shadows stretching toward me like skeletal fingers. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the bed, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. She glided forward, her eyes wide and pleading, and with a hollow voice, she whispered, "Don't go to the basement." Before I could react, the candle blew out, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for my phone, the light illuminating only empty space. The figure was gone, but the air felt thick, pressing down on me like a weight. I grabbed the board, intending to throw it out, but a sudden sound made me stop. It was coming from below. A faint scratching noise, like nails dragging against wood, drifting up from the basement door down the hall. I could barely breathe, my mind filling with images of the girl, her haunting eyes staring at me, her hand clutching her throat. Her warning echoed in my head, but against every instinct, I felt myself moving toward the basement. I needed to know. The scratching grew louder as I approached, a slow, rhythmic scrape that sent chills through me. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating as I remembered her words. But I had to know. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and swung the door open. The smell hit me first, a foul, rotten stench that made me gag. I shined my flashlight down the stairs, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The scratching continued, more frantic now, like something desperate and angry was clawing its way up. I took a step down, my heart pounding, each creak of the old wooden stairs echoing through the silence. The air was thick, almost tangible, and it felt as though something was watching me, waiting just out of sight. Halfway down, I froze. At the bottom of the stairs, I could see something, a figure hunched over, scratching at the wall with long, bony fingers. It was her, but different. She was crouched in the shadows, her back to me, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. Her hair hung limp and matted, and her fingers were bloody, leaving dark streaks on the wall. I couldn't move, paralyzed by the horror of it all, until she slowly turned her head toward me. Her face was a twisted mask of rage, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream, eyes wide with fury and fear. She crawled toward me, her body contorted, moving in a jerky, unnatural way that sent me stumbling backward. I turned and ran up the stairs, her nails scraping against the wood, chasing me, closing the gap with unnatural speed. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it, but the scratching continued, louder, harder, as if she was trying to break through. The whole house seemed to tremble, the walls vibrating with each impact. I backed away, tripping over the Ouija board on the floor. In desperation, I grabbed it, holding it up as if it could protect me. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. I waited, heart racing, the seconds stretching on like hours. And then, in a soft, chilling voice, I heard her whisper, "I warned you." The lights flickered back on, and the house was silent still. The basement door stood closed, no sign of her, or the horrific sounds that had chased me. But as I looked down at the Ouija board in my hands, the planchette moved on its own, sliding slowly across the letters. Leaveno. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the board down, grabbed my things, and ran out of that house, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back, and when my cousin asked why I left so abruptly, I told her the truth. She listened, her face pale and drawn, and she nodded as if she'd been expecting it. "Ella was our great-great-grandmother," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "She died in the basement, strangled by something she claimed was haunting her. They found her scratching at the walls, just like you described. She tried to warn us all, but no one listened. I haven't been back to that house since, and I don't plan on it. Sometimes I still hear her voice in my dreams whispering that final warning, 'Leave now.'" A few years ago, a friend of mine named Liam found an old Ouija board at a garage sale. He was the kind of guy who loved anything dark or creepy, so he bought it without a second thought, convinced he'd found some hidden gem. He invited a few of us over that weekend, saying he wanted to test it out. We thought it was all just for laughs, a way to add some excitement to an otherwise ordinary night. None of us believed in spirits. We figured the worst thing that could happen was we'd get a little spooked, then laugh it off. Liam's apartment was small and dimly lit, filled with his collection of oddities, skulls, taxidermy, and strange art he'd picked up over the years. The Ouija board looked like it had seen better days. The wood was chipped and the letters had faded, as though worn by the touch of countless fingers over the years. It had an unsettling feel to it, but we were all too proud to admit we were nervous. We turned off the lights, lit a few candles, and gathered around the board. Our friend Sarah was the first to place her fingers on the planchette, and one by one we all followed. Liam took charge and asked the first question, "Is there anyone here with us?" For a while, nothing happened. We all exchanged glances, snickering quietly, ready to call it quits. But then the planchette moved. Slowly, shakily, it slid across the board and landed on yes. We all stared at each other, wide-eyed. None of us were pushing it, or so we claimed. Sarah's hands were trembling, but she kept her fingers in place. "Who are you?" Liam asked, his voice more serious now. The planchette began to move again, spelling out one letter at a time. M-Ari. "Mary," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why are you here?" The planchette paused, and then, with a sudden jerk, it moved to the letters one by one, spelling out Iwanttoghome. The word sent a chill through me. I could feel the temperature drop, and the hair on my arms prickled. Liam laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. "Where is your home?" he asked, forcing a smile. But Mary's answer was not what any of us expected. BLOW. I felt a shiver race down my spine. The candles flickered, casting long, warped shadows on the walls, making the room feel tighter, smaller. Sarah wanted to stop, but Liam insisted we keep going. He was intrigued, obsessed almost, as if he was in a trance. "What do you mean, below?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The planchette began to spell out more, faster this time, almost frantic. CANYOUHELPME? We all looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Sarah whispered, "I don't like this, Liam. I don't think we should be doing this." But Liam wouldn't stop. He leaned forward, asking, "How can we help you, Mary?" The planchette stilled, and then it spelled out LIGHT. Light? I asked, confused. What does that mean? At that moment, all the candles flickered, and the flame in each one flared, casting an eerie glow across the room. Then, just as suddenly, they went out, plunging us into total darkness. We scrambled for our phones, fumbling for the flashlights, but when we turned them on, they wouldn't work. Every phone, every flashlight, nothing would turn on. The room was deathly quiet, except for a faint sound, a whisper, like someone breathing softly right next to me. I froze, feeling something cold brush past me, and then I heard it. A faint, broken voice. "Please, help me." Sarah screamed, and we all jumped, our panic filling the room. Liam was the only one who didn't move. He sat there, still and silent, his fingers on the planchette, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though he was in a trance. "Liam!" I shook his shoulder, but he wouldn't respond. His lips moved, whispering something we couldn't make out. Finally, he blinked and looked at us, his face pale. I saw her," he whispered. "She's trapped. She's down there." He pointed to the floor beneath us. "What do you mean, down there?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The basement," he replied. "She's waiting." We all hesitated, but somehow, despite the dread filling me, I felt compelled to follow him. We grabbed a lighter from the kitchen, the only source of light we had, and made our way to the basement door. The air grew colder with every step, an oppressive chill that seemed to sink into my bones. None of us spoke, as if afraid that any sound might wake something lurking in the shadows. The basement door creaked open, revealing a set of old wooden stairs descending into darkness. The lighter cast a faint glow, barely enough to see more than a few steps ahead. But then, as we reached the bottom, the light flared, illuminating the room just long enough for us to see. And we wished we hadn't. In the center of the basement was a shape, a figure, slumped over, its head bowed, hair matted and hanging over its face. It looked like a woman, dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothes, her hands curled into claws. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could barely keep myself from gagging. But it wasn't just the sight that horrified me. It was the feeling, an overwhelming sense of despair and rage radiating from her, filling the room, pressing against us like a weight. We tried to back away, but she lifted her head slowly, her hollow, empty eyes staring right at us. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her lips moving, mouthing words I couldn't hear. But Liam understood. His face was pale as he whispered, "She's asking why we brought her here." "What?" Sarah cried. "We didn't bring her here." The figure began to move, crawling toward us, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her fingers scraped against the concrete floor, leaving bloody streaks as she dragged herself closer, her mouth still moving silently. We stumbled backward, desperate to get away, but the basement door slammed shut behind us, trapping us with her. The room grew colder, and I felt something brush against my arm, a hand, icy and skeletal, gripping me tightly. I looked down, but there was nothing there. Yet the pressure grew, and I felt nails digging into my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Sarah collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her hands clawing at her throat as though something was choking her. Liam dropped the lighter, and in that fleeting darkness I heard a voice, a whisper so close it felt as if it was inside my head. "You brought me here. Now, stay with me." The room filled with a pressure, thick and dark, as if something unseen was crushing us, squeezing the life out of us. My vision blurred, spots dancing before my eyes as I struggled to breathe. Then, just as quickly as it began, the pressure lifted. The door creaked open, and we stumbled up the stairs, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath under the moonlight. When we finally looked at each other, we were all pale, trembling. Liam's arm bore red marks like claw scratches, and Sarah's neck had faint bruises around it, shaped like fingers. None of us said a word as we piled into the car and drove away, leaving the Ouija board and whatever haunted that basement behind us. Liam moved out of that apartment the next day. We never spoke about what happened, and I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to face it again. But sometimes, late at night, I can still feel that cold hand on my arm, and I can still hear her whisper, "Stay with me." It was a snowy evening in late December, and our small group of friends had rented a remote cabin in the mountains for a winter getaway. The cabin was old, with creaky floors, thin walls, and a history that none of us knew but could feel in every corner. A friend, Max, had brought along a Ouija board as a joke, thinking it would be fun to add a little spooky element to the trip. None of us took it seriously until we used it. The first night was quiet and peaceful, the snow piling up outside as we huddled by the fireplace. Around midnight, someone brought out the board. We laughed and joked as we gathered around it, placing our fingers on the planchette. There were 5 of us: Max, Jenny, Taylor, Lisa, and me. Max started with the usual question, his voice dripping with mock drama. "Is anyone here with us?" Nothing happened at first. We all giggled, feeling silly, but then the planchette moved to yes. We accused each other of pushing it, each of us denying it, but the laughter faded as we realized none of us was joking. "What's your name?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky. The planchette spelled out slowly but firmly, Elizabeth. "Elizabeth?" Jenny repeated. "What do you want?" The planchette paused, then slid to Help. A tense silence filled the room. Max, determined to keep up his brave face, tried to laugh it off. "Right. Elizabeth needs our help. What do you need help with, Elizabeth?" The board didn't respond at first. Just when we thought it was over, the planchette jerked suddenly, then began to spell out TRAPE'd. Each letter felt like a heavy blow sinking into us. DOWNSTAIRS. I felt a cold chill at the back of my neck. We hadn't explored much of the cabin, just the main floor, but there was a narrow door at the end of the hall that we hadn't opened yet. We assumed it was a closet, but maybe it was something else. Taylor broke the silence. "This is ridiculous. Someone's obviously messing with us." She lifted her fingers off the planchette, but the board wasn't finished. It moved on its own, spelling out one final message. DONTLEVE. The words seemed to echo in my mind, and a horrible feeling crept over me. Taylor scoffed, brushing it off, but I could see the nervous glances we exchanged. We decided to call it a night, figuring we could laugh about it in the morning. But that wasn't the end. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise, a scraping, scratching sound like nails against wood. I listened, holding my breath as it grew louder, echoing through the thin walls of the cabin. I slipped out of bed and opened my door, finding Max and Jenny in the hallway, their faces pale. They'd heard it too. The noise was coming from the end of the hall where the narrow door was. "What if she's trapped down there?" Jenny whispered, half joking, half terrified. Max rolled his eyes, trying to seem brave, but I could see his hand tremble as he reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. We stared into the blackness, that cold, heavy feeling settling over us like a weight. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it down the stairs. The light barely pierced the darkness, but as we stood there, the scratching sound returned, louder this time, echoing from below. I don't think we should go down there," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But Max, always the brave one, stepped forward. "There's nothing to be afraid of," he said, his voice shaking slightly. He took a step down, then another, and we all followed, more out of fear of being left alone than anything else. The stairs creaked under our weight, each step sending shivers down my spine. The air grew colder and damper as we descended, the smell of mildew filling the narrow space. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, until it seemed to be coming from directly in front of us. Then we saw her. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, dimly lit room, and crouched in the corner was a figure. A woman, her back hunched, her long, tangled hair covering her face. She was clawing at the wall, her fingers bloody and raw, leaving streaks of red on the damp wood. My heart pounded as we froze, unable to look away. She turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural, and her face was twisted in agony. her hollow eyes pleading with us, her lips moving soundlessly. "Help me." The words echoed in the room, though her mouth barely moved. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to get out, but I couldn't move. Her gaze locked onto mine, and I felt trapped, paralyzed by her despair. Then, suddenly, she lunged forward, her bloody hands reaching out, her eyes wide with desperation. We stumbled back, falling over each other as we scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind us. The scratching continued, growing louder, angrier, as if she was trying to claw her way through the door. We bolted into the living room, gasping for breath, huddling together as the scratching finally stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. After a few minutes, Max stood up, his face ashen. We need to leave. We didn't argue. We packed up our things, grabbed our keys, and ran out to the car, barely looking back at the cabin as we sped down the snowy road. The next day, I tried to research the cabin, hoping to find some logical explanation, some way to explain away what we'd seen. After hours of searching, I found a single newspaper article, dated back to the 1930s. A woman named Elizabeth had lived there, a reclusive young woman who had been reported missing after a brutal winter storm. They found her months later in the cellar, her body frozen, her fingers raw and bloody from clawing at the walls. They said she must have been trapped there by the snow, unable to get out, slowly driven mad by the isolation and cold. No one believed me when I tried to tell them what we saw. But every winter, when the snow falls and the nights grow long, I still hear her voice in my dreams, whispering those final, desperate words, "Help me." The sound of scratching is always faint at first, soft as snow falling. But with each passing night, it grows louder, more frantic, like nails scraping against my mind. And every year, I wonder if she's coming back, still trapped, still searching for someone who can set her free.